Welcome to the Faith Lift Message Series 3. Throughout this month, I'm going to be reflecting upon the theological virtue of love. I think it's particularly appropriate for me to do this during the month of February, because February seems to be the month when we are bombarded commercially with red roses, with hearts, with the promise of steak dinners and romantic evenings. But I want us to go a little bit deeper than the Valentine's Day superficiality and commercial opportunity. I want us to delve into the biblical truth about God's love and how this impacts our life. St. Paul encourages us to be ambitious for the higher gifts. Be ambitious for the higher gifts. And he says, I'm going to show you a way which is better than any of them. In short, there are three things that last: faith, hope, and love. And then he says, and the greatest of these is love. So he's emphasizing that the greatest of the theological virtues is this gift of love. Now, the more we become familiar with the writings of St. Paul, we know him as a sometimes hard-hitting, certainly truth-telling, no-holes-barred preacher of the good news. I think you'd agree with me that nobody could accuse St. Paul of being sentimental or slushy in any of the things that he says. And yet, in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we have perhaps one of the most well-known texts from St. Paul. It's certainly one that's very frequently used in wedding services. And St. Paul says that you can be, I'm paraphrasing here, you can be the most eloquent speaker, but without love, you're nothing but a clashing cymbal. I better take note of that. Or you can be the most intelligent, faith-filled, generous person in the universe, but without love, it will do you no good whatsoever. He sets the bar high. He speaks about the primacy of love. And we know he sets the bar high because that text goes on to say in those familiar words, love is always patient and kind. Love is never jealous or boastful. We know those lines very, very well. And when we take time to ponder them, we realize that this call to live with love at the center of our lives is not sentimental. It's not easy. It's something that we can only do in the power and the grace of God. The Catechism, section 1822, says, I'm going to read this to you, love is the theological virtue by which we love God above all things for God's own sake. We love God above all things for God's own sake, and our neighbour as ourselves for the love of God. Now that's very powerful words from the teaching of our church about this virtue of love. Jesus makes love the new commandment. I think we're familiar with this. In John chapter 13, Jesus says, I give you a new commandment. Love one another just as I have loved you. You also must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. You see, love is the hallmark of discipleship. Some of us who are slightly older may remember that 1970s folk hymn. Do you remember? We used to sing, and they'll know we are Christians by our love. But clearly, the love that the gospel calls us to is a little bit more than a folk hymn singing, tambourine playing ditty. It calls for us to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. And this has consequences. This is a high calling. So we might ask ourselves, what is new about the new commandment? Well, certainly the Mosaic law, which we can read about in Deuteronomy 6, stated the importance of love. We can think of that great prayer, that Jewish prayer, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. Beautiful, beautiful words for us to ponder and reflect upon. However, Jesus takes this teaching even further. He sets the standard so high by telling his disciples to love one another as he himself has loved them. And later on, I'm sure they would all begin to discover how profound this message is, because he was speaking about the self-emptying, total self-giving love that he had for each person who ever walked the earth, that he was prepared to lay down his life. So Jesus gave us this new era of the new commandment. And the new commandment is not just about loving God and loving your neighbour. It's primarily about knowing that you are loved by God, knowing that I am a daughter of the living God and that I am loved. In the first letter of St. John, chapter 4, St. John really expresses this beautifully. He says, "We have come to know and to believe in the love God has for us." We've come to know and believe in the love God has for us. Now, I want us just to hold on to that as I share with you a little bit of my experience here. I've been a missionary for a long time, and back in the 1980s, I used to do a lot of parish missions. In those days, in Zion Community, we were walking in the footsteps of the giants who used to be so familiar in leading parish missions. So we'd be walking in the footsteps of the Jesuits and of the Redemptorists and so on. So we had a lot to learn. We were novices, you could say. And I was often tasked with leading the first mission evening, the title of which would be God is Love. And I would do the best that I could, as I'm doing today, to present this life-giving message. I'd be speaking about the love of God. I'd be drawing upon those wonderful words in so many of the prophets. We can think of the prophet Hosea, who speaks about God leading his people with strings of loving kindness. And I'd be presenting the message. And afterwards, we'd go into the parish hall and we'd be maybe drinking tea and talking with people. And a number of people would come up to me and they'd say, thank you for your words, but, there's always a but, isn't there? And they'd say, it's not the same as in the past. We loved those missions in the past where the preacher would come and on the first night he'd give us the message about hell and damnation, and we'd feel a little bit scared, but we'd be very happy we'd come to the mission. And, you know, I'd think about that afterwards, and I'd think, does the Lord call us to follow him out of fear or out of the invitation to love and be loved? Well, I'm going to leave you to ponder that, Take some time this week to think about your image of God and to ask yourself, in the words of St. John, have you come to know and believe in the love of God and the love that He has for you personally?